I did my undergraduate work in astrophysics and math, and I used to think the most profound thing in the world were pulsars, quasars, galaxies. No, the most profound thing in the world is your brain. It is composed of over 100 billion neurons. 100 billion, that's as many stars as are in the Milky Way galaxy. Now, your brain only composes 2% of your body mass, but it uses 20% of your energy. It's an energy hog. And it has the consistency of butter at room temperature. So when you were a junior high kid doing headbutts with other guys, didn't make you a genius, okay? It really messes up your brain. But that's not what your brain is, just the neurons. It's a connection between those neurons. Each neuron has upwards of 10,000 connections with other neurons, synaptic connections. So just do the math. 100 billion times 10,000, that means there's more neurological connections in your brain than there are stars in the entire universe. But that's not your brain. Now, there's some analogies that people use. Your brain is like a computer, 0, 1. That's ridiculous. The brain analogy of a computer doesn't make a bit of sense because it's either on or off. It's a binary code. Your brain is so much more complex than that. Here's a neuron in above, a neuron below, and that gap between the two is called the synapse. Now notice there's little globules going back and forth. Those are neurotransmitters. We discovered over 50 different neurotransmitters. So it's not just 0, 1, it's 50 combinations and permutations at least, and there's many more. But there's not just one synapse, there's innumerable synapses that are firing. But that's not what a thought is. Here's your thoughts. This is what your thought looks like. Neurons that fire together, wire together. What is this thought? For those guys who are married, this is probably the first time you saw your wife. Woo, what a foxy looking lady, look at that gal. And she's looking back at you very shortly, and what does she say? Quite simply, she goes, whoa, not so bad yourself. That's what a thought is like.
The brain molds, and the way that happens is the brain has brain cells that hook up to other brain cells through what's called synapses. Well, when those synapses are being used a lot, they strengthen and they grow. You can actually even see a part of the brain committed to, say, the fingers of a violinist, that part of the brain being thicker. They can see that on imaging. Well, we know the same thing happens if somebody starts looking at pornography. That part of the brain gets a fluid, a whole bunch of synapses developing. And so the brain is molding in response to that pornography or in response to that sexual behavior. And so what someone's doing if they're getting counseling is they're remolding their brain, and the brain can continue molding until death.
In any type of destructive behavior in which we engage, it's kind of like walking in a path through the field. You walk that path over and over again, it gets beaten down, and it's easy to find that path, and it's easy to go down that path or that trail. And any type of behavior, whether it's an addictive behavior or just a habit pattern, we will create trails in our brain that are just going to fire on an automatic sequence.
Let me introduce you to Fred. I've had to take so many neuroscience classes, I had to buy my own brain. Now, your brain has three basic areas, real simply. This is the cortex, is the outer shell. This is the prefrontal cortex, this peach area. It's not fully developed till you're 25. That's why they don't let you rent cars till you're 26, because your accident rate is 6 times the adult rate. So your prefrontal cortex is your impulse control, your executive reasoning. Your brain makes about 5 trillion decisions per second. And so most of what you make your decisions about, you don't make decisions at the conscious level, it's unconscious level. But here's where prefrontal cortex is overpowered. This is your limbic system in the inside. This is your survival system. It identifies areas where you either really, really are interested in an experience or don't want to experience. For example, have you ever had the experience of walking through the woods and all of a sudden you see a snake and you jump back? You didn't even think about it, you just jump back. And then you look at it closer, it's a tree branch. You're going, dummy. Well, what happened is your limbic system doesn't bother to inform the prefrontal part of your cortex. The higher reasoning, it just says, run, Forrest, run. Bang, it just takes off. And your prefrontal cortex looks and goes, wait a minute, it's a tree branch. Your higher reasoning power is your cortex. It's literally in the Greek, it means your bark. It's only 2.4 millimeters thick. It's thick as 6 business cards. That's where all your higher reasoning takes place. But where sexual bondage takes place is usually in your limbic system. You know, we've said many times the battle is in your brain. But sexual bondage, the battle is in your brain because there's an imbalance in your brain. An imbalance between the prefrontal cortex, which is right here, and the limbic system, which is deep in your brain. The limbic system can be far more powerful than the prefrontal cortex, because when something triggers you in your limbic system, say something that you're afraid of or you'll fight over, your prefrontal cortex will be overpowered. Or when there's something that you're really desiring and interested in, like sexual acting out, it'll overpower your prefrontal cortex as well. Remember the stick and snake illustration I used? Classic example of fight or flight symptom. But when we're talking about sexual bondage, we're talking about reprogramming the limbic system. That's where freedom is found.
Wouldn't it be nice if we could just plug our brain into a computer and reprogram it? Well, it's just not that easy. It's a process. Any man in sexual bondage can try as hard as he wants, but he won't succeed because it's a brain problem. Trying to defeat his addiction alone is like trying to do brain surgery on himself. He first needs to understand how the brain works. The prefrontal cortex is his brakes. That's where he makes moral decisions. That's where he says, "Whoa, Charlie, I should be looking at her lustfully." But there's an even more powerful part of the brain, the limbic system, which is his gas pedal. It's where he acts on impulse. It tells him, "Woo-wee, yo, check her out." The limbic system will overpower the prefrontal cortex every single time. It's where bondage takes place. He's dealing with a stronghold, and that stronghold is a noose around his neck. Let's take a look at the components of the noose. The root of bondage are wounds, trauma, or exposure to sexual influences. This is the opening where Satan digs his hook into a man's soul. The mindset of shame is the identity of the addict. After continuously watching porn and acting out, he no longer just feels shameful. He's put on an identity of shame and can't receive God's grace without feeling he has to work hard to deserve it. The addictive lifestyle of binging and purging is the cycle of acting out and repenting. He has to keep numbing the pain from the shame he feels. Finally, the cloak of denial as a massive cover-up. This man is now completely isolated and is a slave to lust. Trying to treat a brain problem with a moral solution only tightens the noose of bondage. It only pushes him deeper into shame the next time he falls. It tells him that his righteousness is not based on the cross, but on his works. The way to cut the noose is to first understand what it is. Then you'll be able to renew your mind, and that takes time and effort. Once you recognize the noose in your life, you'll finally realize why trying harder doesn't work.
The battle happens inside the human brain, which for most people weighs about 3 pounds. The highest faculties we have are our ability to reason and our conscience. Together they form what's known as judgment. This would correspond to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex where we reason, and together this frontal area of our brain is where we reason, plan, organize, make moral decisions, ethical decisions, self-restrain, self-govern. And then the next faculty that I understand in our minds are simply the thoughts that we think, and it can, including the beliefs that we hold, and these are formed in the higher cortex.
The prefrontal cortex is basically the braking system of the brain. It's not fully developed until mid-20s. So in that time when we're learning the most about sex, it's the most intense and wonderful experience we've ever had. We don't have the physical wiring to say, wait a minute, you need to take a break here.
The lowest or the last portion of the brain as God designed would be the emotions or feelings that we have, which are part of the limbic system. Deep into the brain, there's a part of the brain called the amygdala. This is a fear circuit of the brain. And the amygdala connected with another deep structure, and this really kind of down a little bit inside here, called the nucleus accumbens. Okay, where you taste good food and you really like it. Oh, that's good. It's a nucleus accumbens. You fall in love and you're walking on air. Nucleus accumbens. You have an orgasm. Nucleus accumbens. Okay, pleasure registers here. These two amygdala, which is alertness and fear and pleasure, together and with a couple other brain regions, make up what's called our salience network. Salience, relevance. What's important? Remember that. Pay attention. Now, think about the purpose here. The limbic system gives value. to life's experiences. Value as in that's really good, that's something pleasurable, that's something that I want to pay attention to. Value in, hey, that makes me sick, I don't ever eat that again. A value as in that's dangerous, watch out for that, be prepared. As this value is attached, it gives it an emotional attachment and locks it into memory. Some people will talk about an emotional memory. Okay, instead of just a cognitive memory, a fact memory, there's an emotional memory. This happens through your limbic system so that certain events can trigger certain emotions because of previous experience. This is how many addictions happen. When people get addictions of any kind, what happens is they actually develop an emotional attachment to their substance. And that substance will have patterns of behavior associated with that substance or behavior like pornography. They do it in a certain place with a certain computer, a certain time of day, or cocaine. They roll up $20 bills and snort through or whatever. There's things associated with it. And then when they see those associated things like the $20 bill, they'll start having these very intense cravings or desire or emotions because your salience network has associated now these things with that pleasure. Those triggers will actually activate your emotion network to say, hey, wake up, there's something really good about to happen. And then there's a craving or desire that happens, and it also then activates the drive center of your motor cortex called the striatum, where you actually start getting inertia or energy to start going to move to get this thing. There's actually changes in the inertia center of your motor cortex that happens from addiction as well.
The other piece that the brain functions in is learning. And when we learn, the brain changes. Neurons or brain cells connect differently. They make more connections or they break connections. They intensify the chemicals with which the neurons connect. When we're dealing with something as intense as pornography, the message to the brain is essentially magically overwhelming, because to become engaged in the pornography, I have selected the content, the behavior, the actors, all of the information is perfect for me, and I'm in absolute control, which is a happy place for the brain. That involves dopamine and the pleasure center of the brain. When dopamine is involved, it changes how we remember. Things that are intensely pleasurable, frightening, any of the things that come from that area of the brain go into our long-term memory without much further processing. So they become basically written in stone as a memory.
Well, how does the brain get hijacked? Well, guess what? In 2005, Discovery Magazine said one of the most significant things that's been revealed scientifically in the last 25 years is the endogenous reward cycle. Would you translate that for me? I'll be happy to. Your inner reward cycle. Your brain will find out what it really enjoys and will identify it and medicate pain that way. And what happens is your nucleus accumbens sends a signal which comes from the inner limbic system up to the prefrontal cortex and fires dopamine into that prefrontal cortex. So it feels really good. When you have a climax, it feels really, really good. Well, guess how powerful dopamine is? They took some laboratory rats and they put a probe down in their brain, and they set it up so that whenever they pushed this level, dopamine was released in their brain. 100% of the rats overdosed. They had food there, they had water there, they had an available female rat. 100% of the time they kept pushing it until they died. That's how powerful dopamine is. That's why bondage can be so significant. But dopamine's not all bad. How do they hit a baseball? Well, you can't see it all the way in. What happens, it comes so fast that you sense as it releases from the pitcher's hand, it's going to be a good pitch, and you start your swing there. It's a dopamine cycle. How does Tom Brady fade back and in 4 or 5 seconds read the defense and then throw? It's a dopamine cycle. So it's not all bad. The problem is when you have woundedness, hell takes your brain captive for you.
Men can get caught up in that noose that Ted talks about because neurochemically they're attached.
God built us to experience pleasure, but that pleasure is a consequence of healthy actions and decisions. Have you ever struggled with a math problem and then the light went off? And you have to answer, was there a pleasurable feeling with that? That was actually dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, activated from the prefrontal cortex down. As the answer came, truth was realized. Wow, that felt good. That's a God-designed activation of your pleasure. It's supposed to feel good with new discovery. That's the way it's designed. If you've just run 5 miles and you get a runner's high and you feel good after that, it's supposed to feel good with proper exercise. Dopamine actually works in several brain regions. In the prefrontal cortex, dopamine is important for attention, focus, concentration, motivation. So we are designed for pleasure, but it's top-down activation of the pleasure circuits. Addictions decouple the higher cortical functions. When we do that, either through things like pornography, which is an artificial, not God-designed way to activate your pleasure centers, this actually does surge dopamine into the pleasure circuits in a very similar way as drugs do, and it will actually cause alteration of gene expression in these areas of the brain and damage these areas of the brain. So that over the course of time, as you do this, the dopamine circuits of the brain become less and less responsive to normal pleasure. So godly pleasure is no longer pleasurable. I'll give you a simple example. If you're really starving, ravenous, hungry, and there's a fresh bowl of perfectly ripe strawberries on the table, how would those taste? Oh, you taste one and you get pleasure. It tastes sweet. It's good. That's activation of your nucleus accumbens. You're getting dopamine surges. It tastes good. How about we look at that same bowl of strawberries just after you finish your last bite of a Snickers bar? Oh, suddenly that doesn't taste so good. In fact, maybe it's a little bitter or sour and you don't want one. But have the strawberries actually changed in their concentration of fructose, the sugar that's in strawberries? No, they're the same. What's changed is you've artificially overstimulated your taste receptors with a high concentration of man-made sugar product because you can't go out and pick a Snickers bar off a tree. Okay, and after you eat this product, the things that God designed to bring us pleasure suddenly aren't pleasurable anymore.